The cockpit alarms screamed so loudly that they drowned out every other sound. Red warning lights flashed across the instrument panel while the massive passenger jet shuddered high above the endless blue waters below. Every fuel gauge had reached empty. Both engines were seconds away from dying. Captain Ethan Brooks gripped the controls so tightly his knuckles turned white. 24 years of flying had prepared him for almost every emergency imaginable. But not this. "We've lost almost all remaining fuel," his first officer whispered, staring at the displays in disbelief. "Once the engines quit, we won't reach land." The words hit like ice. Behind the cockpit door, 281 passengers had no idea how close they were to disaster. A few moments later, the captain's voice echoed through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are experiencing a critical emergency. Please remain seated and listen carefully to our cabin crew." The silence lasted only a heartbeat. Then panic exploded. Children burst into tears. Someone screamed. Prayers filled the cabin. Parents wrapped trembling arms around their sons and daughters while strangers reached for one another's hands. Phones appeared everywhere as passengers rushed to send what many believed would be their final messages. Outside every window, there was nothing except dark water stretching to the horizon. No airport, no runway, no hope. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with brave smiles hiding terrified eyes, demonstrating the brace position while fighting back tears themselves. Inside the cockpit, the countdown continued. 3 minutes. That was all the aircraft had left before both engines became silent. Captain Brooks stared through the windshield toward the distant horizon. "I've got nowhere to land," he said quietly. No one answered. Then, from the middle of the economy cabin, a clear young voice rose above the chaos. "Please don't prepare for the water." The words were so unexpected that several passengers stopped crying. A small girl, no older than 9, stood clutching a faded blue backpack. Her face wasn't frightened. It was focused. "I know how we can keep flying," she said. For a second, the entire cabin froze. Some passengers looked at her with confusion. Others shook their heads, convinced fear had made the child imagine impossible things. But the little girl wasn't guessing. She had been watching the sky since takeoff, and she had just seen something every experienced adult on board had completely missed. "Before we begin, comment where you're watching from. Should I continue with the next segment?" Just 2 hours earlier, Flight 728 had looked like any other afternoon journey. The sleek passenger jet climbed smoothly into the bright autumn sky after departing from Seattle, bound for Minneapolis. Soft sunlight streamed through the cabin windows while passengers settled into familiar routines. Some opened laptops. Others watched movies, read books, or drifted off to sleep as the engines hummed steadily beneath them. In seat 18A sat 9-year-old Emma Carter. Unlike everyone else, she barely glanced at the entertainment screen in front of her. Her attention never left the window. With a small notebook balanced on her lap, Emma carefully sketched the wing outside. Every few minutes, she scribbled another note beside her drawing. Wind direction, flap position, cloud height. To anyone passing by, she looked like a child doodling during a long flight. She wasn't. She was studying. The businessman beside her smiled politely. "That's quite a drawing." Emma looked up and returned the smile. "I'm trying to figure out how the airflow changes when the wind shifts." The man chuckled. "That's not something most kids think about." "I know," she answered matter-of-factly before turning back toward the window. Across the aisle, a college student laughed at videos on his phone while an elderly couple quietly shared snacks from a paper bag. A toddler several rows ahead proudly showed everyone his toy airplane, making tiny engine noises that brought smiles to nearby passengers. The atmosphere was peaceful, warm, ordinary. Flight attendant Rebecca Hayes walked down the aisle, checking seatbelts and offering drinks. When she reached Emma, she noticed the notebook filled with tiny aircraft sketches. "Future pilot?" she asked. Emma nodded. "I hope so." Rebecca handed her an extra packet of cookies. "Keep dreaming big." Emma smiled. "I don't just want to fly airplanes." "What do you want?" "I want to understand the sky." Rebecca laughed softly, assuming it was the innocent imagination of a bright child. She had no idea how serious Emma was. Thousands of feet above the mountains, Captain Ethan Brooks and First Officer Daniel Ruiz monitored an uneventful flight from the cockpit. The weather radar showed scattered clouds ahead, nothing unusual for the route. Everything appeared perfect, but perfection lasted only another few minutes. As Emma gazed across the wing once more, something caught her attention. A thin, shimmering trail glistened briefly in the sunlight before disappearing into the rushing air behind the aircraft. Her smile slowly faded. She leaned closer to the window. A second trail appeared, then another. Emma's heartbeat quickened. Her pencil slipped from her fingers. "No," she whispered under her breath. "That isn't supposed to happen." Far ahead, hidden behind the cockpit door, warning lights had not yet begun to flash. But Emma already knew something was terribly wrong. As Emma stared at the strange liquid streaming from beneath the wing, memories she had carried since childhood rushed back with remarkable clarity. Not long ago, she had been standing barefoot on a quiet grass airfield, her hands wrapped around the control stick of a tiny white glider. The morning sun had barely risen, painting the horizon in soft shades of gold while the cool breeze whispered across the runway. Standing beside her was her grandfather, Captain Nathan Carter. Long before retirement, Nathan had been one of the country's most respected glider instructors. Unlike airline pilots who depended on engines, he believed true pilots learned to trust the wind itself. He often smiled and said, "Engines make flying easier. Understanding the sky makes flying possible." Most children spent weekends playing video games. Emma spent hers studying clouds. At 6 years old, she could already identify different cloud formations better than many student pilots. Nathan never treated her like a child. He challenged her with questions instead. "What does that cloud tell you?" Emma would stare upward. "Cumulus." "And underneath it?" She closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the breeze brush across her face. "Warm air rising." Nathan grinned proudly. "Exactly." Their lessons were never about memorizing textbooks. He taught her to observe, to listen, to feel changes in temperature on her skin, to notice birds circling without flapping their wings, to understand that the sky was constantly moving, even when it looked perfectly still. Over the next 3 years, Emma accumulated hundreds of hours flying silent gliders with her grandfather. She learned how invisible currents could lift an aircraft without a single drop of fuel. Some lessons were difficult. On one flight, the rising air disappeared unexpectedly, forcing Nathan to guide Emma through an emergency landing in an open meadow. Afterward, while she apologized for making mistakes, Nathan simply laughed. "A pilot isn't judged by perfect flights," he said. "A pilot is judged by what they do when everything goes wrong." Those words stayed with her. Before every flight, Nathan would hand her a weather chart instead of a toy. "Read the sky before you trust the airplane." Emma never forgot. Back in the present, she pressed her forehead gently against the cabin window. The shimmering trail outside was growing longer. She recognized it immediately. It wasn't rain. It wasn't ice. It wasn't normal condensation. It looked frighteningly similar to something her grandfather had once shown her during a maintenance inspection years earlier. Fuel. Cold fear settled deep inside her chest. Around her, passengers continued watching movies, laughing and chatting, completely unaware that every passing second was carrying Flight 728 closer to a catastrophe that only one little girl seemed to recognize. Emma's pulse quickened as she kept her eyes fixed on the wing. The silvery stream was no longer occasional. It had become steady. Tiny droplets caught the afternoon sunlight before vanishing into the rushing air behind the aircraft. She didn't need anyone to tell her what it meant. Somewhere, fuel was escaping. Her grandfather's voice echoed in her memory. "If fuel is leaving the airplane anywhere except the engines, time becomes your greatest enemy." Emma immediately unbuckled her seatbelt. The businessman beside her looked surprised. "Where are you going, kid?" "I need to tell the pilots." He smiled politely, assuming she was frightened. "They already know whatever's happening." Emma wasn't so sure. She hurried toward the front of the cabin just as the aircraft gave a sudden, violent shudder. The overhead bins rattled. Several passengers looked around nervously. Then came another vibration. This one lasted longer. Conversations slowly faded. Even the crying toddler stopped and looked toward his mother. Moments later, the captain's voice came over the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we've detected an issue with one of our fuel monitoring systems. At the moment, there is no immediate danger. Our crew is investigating the situation. We ask that everyone remain seated. A few nervous smiles appeared. Most passengers believed him. Emma didn't. The captain wasn't lying to frighten them. He was trying to keep them calm. But she knew one thing. Fuel didn't pour out of an airplane because of a faulty gauge. Behind the locked cockpit door, the atmosphere was nothing like the calm announcement. Captain Ethan Brooks stared at the engine displays in disbelief. "What am I looking at?" First Officer Daniel Ruiz rapidly switched between system pages. "It isn't the sensor." His voice was almost a whisper. "It's real." The fuel quantity indicators continued falling at an impossible speed. Every few seconds, another warning illuminated. Fuel imbalance, low pressure, pump failure, crossfeed unavailable. Daniel grabbed the emergency checklist. No response from the transfer system. Captain Brooks immediately contacted air traffic control. "Mayday, Mayday, Flight 728 declaring an emergency. We're experiencing catastrophic fuel loss. Request immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport." The controller answered almost instantly. "Flight 728, nearest airport is 63 miles east." Daniel's calculator finished its estimate. His face turned pale. "We don't have the fuel." "How long?" Daniel swallowed hard. "Maybe 7 minutes." Silence filled the cockpit. 7 minutes until both engines became nothing more than dead weight. Captain Brooks stared through the windshield. Below them stretched hundreds of square miles of cold wilderness and a vast mountain lake. No runway, no highways, no safe fields, only forests, jagged hills, and freezing water. Back in the cabin, Emma looked through the opposite window instead of the one beside her. Far ahead, scattered across the horizon, towering white clouds were beginning to rise into the afternoon sky. Most passengers saw ordinary clouds. Emma saw something entirely different. Hope. She whispered to herself, "Grandpa, I think the sky is trying to help us." At that exact moment, the aircraft lurched once again. This time, every passenger knew something was terribly wrong. The warning alarms echoed through the cockpit just as the aircraft trembled again. Captain Ethan Brooks looked from one display to another, hoping at least one of them was wrong. None of them were. The fuel gauges had almost reached zero. First Officer Daniel Ruiz spoke quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. "Captain, we've lost too much. Even at minimum burn, both engines won't stay running much longer." Brooks nodded slowly before pressing the intercom. His voice remained calm, but every word carried the weight of reality. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. We have declared an emergency. Our crew is preparing for a precautionary landing. Please follow every instruction given by the cabin crew." The moment the announcement ended, fear swept through the cabin like a wave. Some passengers buried their faces in their hands. Others reached for loved ones. A mother hugged her little boy so tightly he could barely breathe. Across the aisle, an elderly man quietly removed his wedding ring, kissed it, and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Flight attendant Rebecca Hayes walked down the aisle with remarkable composure, demonstrating the brace position while hiding the tears forming in her eyes. She stopped beside Emma. "Honey," she said gently, "I need you to stay buckled." Emma shook her head. "No." Rebecca blinked. "I have to speak with the captain." "I'm sorry, sweetheart. Nobody can enter the cockpit." Emma looked directly into her eyes. "If they try to land in the lake, hundreds of people could die." Rebecca froze. "How do you know that?" "Because I know what happens when engines stop." The flight attendant assumed she was frightened. "It's okay to be scared." "I'm not scared." Emma's voice was calm. "I'm running out of time." She turned toward the window and pointed into the distance. "Do you see those tall clouds?" Rebecca looked. "They're just clouds." "No," Emma answered softly. "They're rising air." Rebecca frowned. Emma continued before she could interrupt. "My grandfather taught me to fly gliders. I've spent years learning how to stay in the sky without engines." Rebecca stared at the quiet little girl. You fly? Emma nodded. Without fuel. Without engines. Rebecca couldn't believe what she was hearing. Then Emma said something that made the flight attendant's heart skip a beat. This airplane doesn't stop flying when the engines quit. It becomes the biggest glider you've ever seen. Before Rebecca could respond, a loud boom echoed beneath the cabin floor. The entire aircraft lurched violently. The left engine's roar faded into an eerie silence. Passengers screamed. Overhead lights flickered. Inside the cockpit, Daniel's eyes widened. "Captain!" The left engine display went black. Seconds later, the right engine began coughing, surging as it consumed the last drops of fuel. Brooks stared ahead, knowing they had less than a minute before complete silence filled the sky. Rebecca looked back at Emma. For the first time, she wasn't looking at a frightened child. She was looking at the only person on board who seemed to know exactly what came next. Without another word, Rebecca grabbed Emma's hand and hurried toward the cockpit door. Rebecca's hand barely left the cockpit door before she slammed the emergency chime. "Captain, you need to hear this!" "Not now!" Captain Ethan Brooks shouted without turning around. His eyes remained fixed on the rapidly falling altitude and the blinking warning lights. "We're seconds away from losing the second engine." "It's about the engines," Rebecca yelled back. "This little girl says she knows how to keep us flying." For a brief moment, silence filled the cockpit. Captain Brooks exchanged a puzzled glance with First Officer Daniel Ruiz. "What?" Rebecca opened the reinforced door. Emma stepped inside. The cockpit suddenly felt enormous around her. Bright screens flashed red. Warning alarms echoed from every direction. Outside the windshield, endless wilderness stretched toward the horizon. Captain Brooks stared in disbelief. "This is the passenger?" Emma nodded confidently. "Yes, sir." Brooks looked at Rebecca. "We don't have time for this." "You have less than a minute," Emma answered before anyone else could speak. "That's exactly why I'm here." Daniel noticed something unusual. The child wasn't trembling. She wasn't crying. She wasn't overwhelmed. She was studying the instruments. "You've flown before?" Daniel asked cautiously. "Gliders." "How many hours?" Emma thought for a moment. "Just over 400. Captain Brooks frowned. "A glider weighs a few hundred kilograms. This aircraft weighs more than 70 tons. "I know. So how exactly do you expect glider experience to help us?" Emma stepped closer to the navigation display. "Because in less than 60 seconds, this airplane will stop being an airliner." She pointed toward the windshield. "It will become a glider." The captain opened his mouth to argue. Emma continued. "An aircraft doesn't fall just because its engines stop. Wings don't care whether thrust comes from engines or gravity. As long as they're moving through the air fast enough, they'll keep producing lift." Daniel slowly nodded. "She's right." Emma pointed toward a group of towering white clouds glowing in the afternoon sun. "Those clouds weren't there by accident." Captain Brooks followed her finger. "They're ordinary cumulus. They're markers." "Markers for what?" "For rising air." She took a deep breath. "My grandfather taught me that every cloud tells a story. Those clouds are being fed by strong thermals, invisible columns of warm air rising from the ground." Daniel looked back at the flight computer. "If we could ride those updrafts," Emma finished his sentence, "we could stretch our glide long enough to reach land." The captain remained silent. Years of training told him to follow established emergency procedures. Every checklist said prepare for an off-airport landing. None of them mentioned trusting a 9-year-old. Just then, bang! The remaining engine gave one violent shudder. Its roar faded into a hollow whine. The cockpit became eerily quiet. Only the sound of rushing wind surrounded them. Daniel stared at the instruments. "Captain," he swallowed hard. "Both engines have flamed out." The aircraft was now gliding. Captain Brooks looked at Emma, then back at the endless clouds ahead. Finally, he made the hardest decision of his career. "All right, Emma." His voice was calm. "Show us how to fly without engines." An unsettling silence swallowed the cockpit. For the first time in Captain Ethan Brooks' 24-year career, there was no comforting roar of jet engines, only the relentless whistle of wind sweeping across the wings. The aircraft continued forward. but every passing second stole another few feet of precious altitude. Altitude, 28,000 feet, descending 1,300 feet per minute, Daniel called, forcing himself to stay calm. The master warning lights continued flashing, but nobody looked at them anymore. They already knew the engines were gone. Now every decision mattered. Emma stepped closer to the windshield, her eyes searching the sky rather than the instruments. "Don't fight the descent," she said quietly. Captain Brooks tightened his grip on the controls. "Every instinct tells me to." "I know." She smiled faintly. "My grandfather said that's the hardest lesson. Trust the wings." Brooks carefully lowered the nose until the airspeed stabilized. The aircraft immediately felt smoother. Daniel watched the flight computer. "Our glide is improving." Emma pointed ahead. There. A towering white cloud floated against the blue sky like a mountain made of cotton. "Don't fly through the middle." Captain Brooks looked puzzled. "Why not?" "Because the strongest lift isn't always in the center. We enter from the edge and let the airplane tell us where the rising air is." The massive jet drifted toward the cloud. Inside the cabin, passengers had noticed the strange silence. Children stopped crying. Adults stared nervously through the windows. The absence of engine noise was almost more frightening than the alarms had been. Rebecca stood near the front galley, silently praying while watching the closed cockpit door. Inside, Emma whispered, "Almost there." Without warning, the aircraft jolted upward, not violently, just enough to lift everyone slightly in their seats. Daniel's eyes shot toward the vertical speed indicator. "Captain," the needle climbed. "Descent rate just dropped to 700 feet per minute." Emma didn't celebrate. "Stay in the turn." Captain Brooks gently banked the aircraft. The enormous jet began circling through the invisible column of rising air. The controls felt strangely lighter. The airplane seemed almost eager to climb. Daniel could hardly believe the numbers. 500 feet per minute. Another few seconds passed. Then, 300. Captain Brooks stared at the instruments in disbelief. "We're slowing our descent." Emma shook her head with a confident smile. "No." She pointed toward the horizon. "We're soaring." The aircraft completed another wide circle. This time the vertical speed indicator briefly touched 0. For one breathtaking moment, the powerless airliner stopped losing altitude altogether. Hope exploded inside the cockpit, but Emma's smile quickly faded. She looked beyond the first cloud toward the distant horizon. "The lift is weakening." Captain Brooks looked over. "What does that mean?" "It means this thermal is dying." She pointed toward another cluster of towering clouds much farther ahead. "We have one chance to reach the next one." Daniel checked the remaining altitude. His expression grew tense once again. "If she's wrong." Nobody finished the sentence. Captain Brooks slowly rolled the wings level and aimed the silent aircraft toward the next invisible lifeline in the sky. The enormous jet sliced silently through the sky, racing toward the final cloud formation. Inside the cockpit, nobody spoke. Captain Ethan Brooks kept his eyes fixed ahead while Daniel continuously called out the numbers. Altitude, 23,000 feet. Distance to the nearest runway, 14 miles. The calculations weren't encouraging. Even with the altitude they had recovered, they were still cutting it dangerously close. Emma leaned toward the windshield, scanning the landscape below instead of the instruments. The endless forest was finally giving way to open farmland. Beyond it, she spotted a narrow strip of asphalt. The airport. "There," she shouted. "Straight ahead." Captain Brooks followed her finger. "I have the runway." But Emma wasn't looking at the runway anymore. She was watching the sky above it. Her face suddenly lit up. "I found it." Daniel frowned. "Found what?" She pointed toward a flock of hawks circling without flapping their wings. "They're climbing." Captain Brooks narrowed his eyes. "They're just birds. They're showing us where the strongest thermal is." Without hesitation, Brooks banked the powerless aircraft toward the circling birds. The moment the Boeing crossed beneath them, the entire airplane trembled. The nose lifted. Daniel stared at the instruments. Vertical speed, -600. A second later, -300. Then, +100. His eyes widened. "We're climbing." For several unbelievable seconds, The 70-ton aircraft actually gained altitude without a single drop of fuel. Emma smiled. The sky isn't finished helping us. They completed one slow circle before the invisible lift weakened. That's enough, Emma said. We have the height we need. Captain Brooks rolled the wings level. The runway now filled the windshield. Everything depended on one final approach. Landing gear? Daniel asked. Emma nodded. Not yet. Wait. Every second mattered. Lowering the gear too early would rob them of precious distance. Too late, and they would arrive too fast. The runway numbers grew larger. Emma took one deep breath. Now. Captain Brooks lowered the landing gear. A heavy vibration rolled through the aircraft as the wheels locked into place. Immediately, the airplane began descending faster. Daniel looked nervous. We're dropping. That's expected, Emma replied calmly. Stay on the glide. 1 mile remained. Passengers inside the cabin held their breath. Some closed their eyes. Others stared silently through the windows. Rebecca clasped her hands together. Please. Half a mile. Emma watched every movement. Flaps. 15. Captain Brooks complied. The airplane settled perfectly onto the approach path. 300 feet. 200. The runway rushed toward them. Easy, Emma whispered. Don't force it. 100 feet. 50. Captain Brooks gently raised the nose. The main landing gear kissed the runway with a solid thump before the nose wheel settled smoothly onto the pavement. Cheers erupted throughout the cabin, but the aircraft wasn't finished. Without engine thrust, it continued rolling faster than anyone wanted. The end of the runway rushed toward them. Daniel shouted, Captain, we're running out of pavement. The runway disappeared beneath the aircraft at breathtaking speed. Captain Ethan Brooks stood firmly on the brakes, his entire body leaning forward with the effort. The powerless jet continued rolling, its tires screaming against the pavement as clouds of white smoke billowed behind them. Speed, 80 knots, Daniel called. The runway lights flashed past. 60. The end of the runway rushed closer. Passengers held their breath. Nobody dared to move. Finally, the aircraft slowed to a crawl. Then, with barely 100 yards of pavement remaining, it rolled to a complete stop. For 2 long seconds, absolute silence filled the cabin. No one spoke. No one even breathed. Captain Brooks stared through the windshield, almost unable to believe what he was seeing. They were on solid ground, alive. Daniel slowly removed his trembling hands from the controls. His voice cracked. We actually made it. The tension that had held the cockpit together for the last half hour shattered all at once. Captain Brooks leaned back in his seat, covering his face with both hands. Years of discipline could no longer hold back the emotion. He quietly wept. Beside him, Daniel wiped tears from his eyes before laughing in complete disbelief. We landed a jet with no engines. Emma simply looked out the windshield toward the bright afternoon sky. The same clouds that had guided them were already drifting farther away, as though nothing extraordinary had happened. A gentle smile crossed her face. Thank you, Grandpa, she whispered. Outside, airport fire trucks, ambulances, and police vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Emergency crews raced toward every exit expecting chaos. Instead, they found something remarkable. Passengers were standing, hugging one another, laughing through tears. Parents kissed their children. Complete strangers embraced like lifelong friends. As the cabin door finally opened, applause erupted once again. One by one, the survivors stepped onto the mobile stairs, many stopping to touch the side of the aircraft as if making sure it was real. News helicopters circled overhead. Television cameras had already gathered beyond the security fence. Everyone wanted to know how a powerless passenger jet had somehow landed safely. Captain Brooks walked down the stairs last. Instead of facing the reporters waiting below, he turned around and extended his hand toward the small figure standing in the doorway. Emma hesitated. She wasn't looking for attention, but Captain Brooks smiled warmly. You belong out here with us. She slowly took his hand. The cameras immediately focused on the quiet little girl. Reporters began shouting questions from every direction. Captain, who saved the aircraft? Captain Brooks didn't hesitate for even a second. He gently placed his hand on Emma's shoulder. "Today," he said, his voice filled with emotion, "every single person on this airplane is alive because one little girl had the courage to speak, and because we finally had the wisdom to listen." The days that followed changed countless lives forever. Investigators worked around the clock to determine what had nearly turned Flight 728 into one of the nation's worst aviation disasters. After examining the aircraft, they discovered a hidden manufacturing defect inside a critical fuel delivery component. The failure had allowed fuel to escape far faster than any onboard system could compensate for. Within hours, aviation authorities ordered inspections across hundreds of aircraft equipped with the same part. What had happened on Flight 728 wasn't simply an isolated emergency. It was a warning that could prevent future tragedies. But while engineers searched for technical answers, the world couldn't stop talking about something else: a 9-year-old girl who refused to stay silent. Reporters filled every television network. Newspapers called her the child who read the sky. Yet whenever someone praised Emma as a hero, she always gave the same answer: "I didn't save the airplane by myself. I shared what my grandfather spent years teaching me." A week later, Captain Ethan Brooks invited Emma and her grandfather, Nathan Carter, to the airline's headquarters. Standing before pilots, mechanics, flight attendants, and airline executives, the captain stepped to the microphone. "I've flown airplanes for nearly a quarter of a century. I believed experience meant having every answer." He paused and looked toward Emma. "That day I learned the greatest lesson of my career. Real leaders never stop learning. They listen, even when wisdom comes from someone half their height." The audience rose to their feet in a long, standing ovation. Nathan quietly placed a hand on Emma's shoulder. "I'm proud of the pilot you've become." Emma smiled. "You always told me the sky speaks." Nathan nodded. "And you had the courage to listen." Months later, Emma returned to the same quiet grass airfield where her dream had first begun. A gentle breeze drifted across the runway as another glider lifted silently into the blue sky. She watched it disappear beneath towering white clouds. Somewhere above, invisible rivers of warm air continued their endless dance, just as they always had. Emma realized something that day. Knowledge isn't measured by age. Courage isn't measured by size. Sometimes the smallest voice carries the answer everyone else is searching for. She looked toward the clouds, smiled, and whispered, "Thank you for showing us the way." If this story touched your heart, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes it's never too early to make a difference. Because one brave voice can change hundreds of lives.